when a murder is discovered.
She was in the bathtub where the killer had placed her. It just looked bad.
It doesn't just destroy one life.
I couldn't understand why. Why would somebody do such a terrible thing?
It tears communities apart.
You can still speak to residents now, and they say they've never got over it. They still feel deep sorrow at what happened to a young man in the midst of their little community here.
It's up to the police to not only solve the mystery.
That was our hope, is that where we were going was going to provide us with a treasure chest of information.
And track down the killer, but bring them to justice.
The absence of a head or hands can impede identification, but it certainly doesn't make it impossible.
In this episode, the body of a woman is found in a suburban part of Nottingham.
I came out of the door and this girl was actually lying on the doorstep. She looked asleep, she looked quite peaceful.
Meet the murder detectives, who reveal how they caught the killer.
She crossed the road from here. What we then see is an image of the offender looking across the road towards her.
You have one chance to get that evidence. If you miss it, if you lose it, it's gone forever.
In the city of Nottingham, on a Sunday morning in July 2011, a body had been found in a suburban street.
I was at work this particular morning and the body had been reported to the police and paramedics had attended. A young female, we didn't know who she was at that time, and she's in an alleyway, and clearly the family that lived adjacent to where she was found hadn't got a clue who she was and how she got there.
Senior investigating officer Tony Hayden began a homicide inquiry. The person who had called the police was Christine Fletcher.
I got up in the morning, usual having breakfast, and my husband said to me, "Did you hear anything last night?" And I said, "No, why did you?" And he said, "Yes, someone's shouting." But he thought it was somebody just walking past. And that was it. And then as I came out, I was going to work that day, and I came out of the door, and this girl was actually lying on the doorstep. And at first I thought she was asleep. She looked asleep. She looked quite peaceful. And I said to my husband, "I think somebody asleep on the doorstep." And he came over and then he felt her and said, "I think she's dead." So I immediately went inside and phoned 999.
Detective Sergeant Mark Petrovich was part of the major crime unit assigned to the case.
It's rare that you'll get a phone call like that in the morning to say, "I've just discovered the body of a young female in my garden." So uniformed police officers attended the scene very quickly, and we spoke to that member of the public who reported the discovery of the body and took down as much details as we possibly could.
With officers already at the scene, SIO Tony needed to decide on his next steps.
I just began to assess exactly what I'd got from the information that I'd received from the scene, rather than travelling there directly. It was relatively early that I contacted the coroner because I suspected we'd need to do something unusual in this particular case, and I needed permission to call out a Home Office pathologist to join me at the scene. I set out some initial inquiries and then I travelled to the scene myself.
One of the Home Office pathologists assigned to the case was Dr. Stuart Hamilton.
At that point, when the body is discovered, literally all we really knew was that a young woman's body had been found in an alleyway. That in itself is suspicious. As time goes along, the investigations will reveal more information, but pretty much you've got a very open field of what could have happened.
The area of Nottingham where the body had been found was a quiet residential street.
Thornywood Mount here goes to Mapley. Mapley's quiet. St Anne's is mayhem. It's very, very quiet here. But it's that thoroughfare between an area that's got problems and an area that's very nice.
Rebecca Sherdley is a local crime reporter who picked up this case early on.
In Nottingham, Obviously there's a level of crime, there's different types of crime. I see different court cases at the Crown Court involving quite brutal murders, rapes, child sex offences, but random attacks by strangers on women, that's rare.
So as I arrive at the scene, the area's been cordoned off, and that's my first role really, is to make sure everything is okay. I waited for the Home Office pathologist before I went anywhere near the body.
The scene was very busy and the whole area ground to a halt.
The paramedics and everybody came to the house, and literally they closed off the road, and it was closed all day. I actually went off to work because I couldn't do anything. And when I came off at night, I had to get off the bus 2 stops before I normally get off, and have to go through the cordon to get back to my house.
The paramedics had attended, and they'd done some initial signs of life investigation and really pronounced her dead. The initial officer that had attended had given an account to my detectives along the lines of what she was wearing, and that there was a little bit of blood on the pavement area between the 2 houses. What first struck me is that this is an area that's so normal, so natural, and to see a young female that was clearly dead in the alleyway here was just quite a shock. But once you get over that, you then have to begin to think, what am I going to do when I start to investigate the death? There was a lot of cars on the road, and one of the things that I considered was, had she been hit by a car? So I wanted to examine all these vehicles. Are there going to be fingerprints or DNA on a vehicle that will be significant?
It was just shock, because no one knew who she was, and no one knew why she was in that area. I thought she was about 16. She looked like a very young girl.
Happy the scene was secure, Tony and the pathologist approached the body.
We would have stopped here and had a good look round this area first. Her head was at this end. She was about 10 feet up. She was in the fetal position. This was one of those cases where I didn't really understand what had happened. When we began to look at her body, it was clearly evident that she had had a child. So that kind of indicated to us that she was maybe a bit older than we initially thought. She'd got some tattoos with names on, so again, that was important. I fed that back very, very quickly to try and identify her.
The key things at the crime scene were that, first of all, we have a young woman with injuries. That's automatically telling you there's a very good chance this is a homicide. At that point, you're going to do initial samples, initial tests, looking for fibres, looking for trace evidence.
Trace evidence refers to materials that can be transferred during a crime. And this could be anything from gunshot residue, it could be human hair or animal hair, fabric fibres, fibres from rope, fragments of glass, all manner of things can constitute trace evidence.
As we began to look externally initially at Caroline's clothing, it was all intact.
As the initial undressing of the victim went on, it was clear that her underwear had been disturbed. So we're now moving from simply what's likely to be a homicide to what's likely to be a sexual homicide.
With a sexual motive identified, a picture was beginning to form of the attacker.
The fact that her clothing was moved as opposed to being torn off or completely ripped off shows that actually he was, in his mind, extending a level of courtesy to her. It's very likely that he asked her during the course of the attack to go along with what he was doing.
For many people, it would seem that the victim's body was left at the scene for quite a long time, and in some ways, it was. The thing is that, particularly when you're looking at what could be an assault by a stranger, you don't know what evidence is going to be important, and trace evidence, blood patterns, all of these things can be very easily lost if you try to go in and move that body too quickly. You have one chance to get that evidence. If you miss it, if you lose it, it's gone forever.
I was not going to encroach on her body in any way. I did go very close, I got down and had a real good look. There was absolutely really nothing to pick up. Nothing was left, no debris. I knew she'd got a shoe missing. So that was my first priority, is where was her shoe? So all these houses and all these gardens were all searched on that first day.
While the scene where the body was found wasn't presenting any clues as to what had happened to this woman, the forensics team were hoping that the post-mortem would.
That post-mortem was crucial to our investigation. It appeared there'd been a struggle and some clothing had been moved, including her left breast being exposed. So straight away we were thinking this was a sexually motivated attack.
With this victim, we have bruising on the arms. That looks like somebody has tried to restrain her. And we do have bruising on her knuckles. She has probably punched something or someone. These are little bits of evidence that can build a picture of somebody who's trying to get away from an assailant. And it puts everything into the context of what's happened is not a simple accident, not something consensual that's gone wrong. It's somebody who is literally fighting for her life.
In Nottingham, England, early on a Sunday morning, the body of a woman had been found outside a house in a suburban street. She had been sexually assaulted.
One of our priorities was to identify who this person was that had been found dead. We checked all the missing persons reports. That was negative. We checked all the messages from members of the public that were ringing in, and that was negative. So it was a real mystery as to who this person was.
Once the scene of crime was cleared of evidence, the body had been sent to the mortuary for post-mortem.
The key findings at the initial post-mortem examination were that there were a considerable number of external injuries. In this case, the other thing that was useful to find was that the victim had tattoos, one of which had 2 names on it. And that potentially is going to help you link a body to a family.
As the team in the office attempted to identify their victim, a man came into the station to report a missing person.
I was at St Anne's police station when the partner of Caroline Coyne attended the police station to report that she had been missing from home from the previous evening. He gave me descriptive details of tattoos that Caroline had that very quickly we believed to match the body that we'd discovered.
As the family liaison officer on the team, Mark was tasked with breaking the news.
One of the most challenging parts of being a family liaison officer is to tell a family member, in this case, Caroline's partner, of the death of their partner. They, at that moment, do not know. They're hoping for the best. She's gone missing. They were hoping that she'd return home by a certain time. She hadn't. It then rolled on to seeing her mother and the rest of the family and passing on that information on to them as well. The reaction from Caroline's partner on delivering the message was one of sheer devastation. He had a little inkling that something wasn't right, but no way did he think that she'd been killed.
As Caroline had been identified, Tony put out a public appeal for information at the end of day 1.
The first thing that I found out about a woman's body being found in Nottingham when the police began to appeal for witnesses.
The next day was horrendous. We woke up, pulled back the curtains, and the whole road was just full of media. Now, they did warn us about this. They said, you know, if you want to go away for a few days, and we just thought, oh, it won't be anything, it'll just be like local news or something, you know, didn't sort of expect all that. But, you know, there was everybody there the next day from the papers.
She was a care assistant, so there was quite a heartfelt response from the company where she worked. But I think most people were just reeling from the fact that this young woman had died so callously and alone in a pathway in an area of Nottingham that had never seen that sort of crime before.
There was flowers all outside the house. That was quite wrenching, and some people did knock on the door and say they were relatives of Caroline, and they just came to see where it had happened. So it was a very sad time.
Now Caroline had been identified, Mark began the delicate task of finding out where she had been that night.
From speaking to the family, Caroline's family, we'd established that she'd been to a family party where they'd had a few drinks, and Caroline had decided to leave that party and to go elsewhere. The family weren't aware of where she'd actually ended up, and it was then a case of us piecing her last movements from when she left the family home to where we'd found her. That involved extensive trawls of CCTV around the Nottingham city centre area.
The officer coordinating the search for video evidence was CCTV investigator Pauline Austin.
The details went out, as I believe, on the news that day, and I believe that it was a transport officer in the city who told us that on the previous evening their bus was going up Porchester Road when somebody had jumped out in front of the bus and nearly got run over.
The bus had a CCTV camera that had captured Caroline walking in the road.
You could see from the footage that she was shaky, she was unsteady on her feet, and she appeared to be drunk and very vulnerable.
The area where the girl had run in front of the bus was quite close to Thornywood Mount. Looking down there's two premises, one on either side of the road, that had got good CCTV. Looking at it at the relevant times, I can see a girl come across on that side of the road, across the mouth of the drive.
She starts to trot, so she's clearly beginning to move quicker than normal as she gets halfway through the junction.
And she's closely pursued by a man.
What I knew from the outset was that the offender was no more than sort of 10 yards behind her.
With a potential suspect and the victim Caroline caught on CCTV, the team began to widen their search.
She goes down the road in the direction of where later we find the body. He's in pursuit of her. It's difficult to tell, but she's walking very quickly and he's walking very quickly. There's another camera across the road. When you look at that, you see that the girl has now crossed over to that side of the road, which is the same side as where the house was, where she was found.
She crossed the road from here. What we then see is an image of the offender looking across the road towards her. It was abundantly obvious that whoever the man was the person that was going to follow Caroline into Thornywood Mount and subsequently attack her.
It's very common for this type of rapist, the rapist who is using the act as a substitute for a relationship, to begin by stalking. It's quite common for them to identify someone, generally somebody who's about their own age, and to stalk them, to follow them, to observe them.
Having tracked the suspect to the place where the body was found, Pauline began to look for CCTV of him leaving.
Well, where does he go from there? Some CCTV's been collected from premises across the road from there. I see somebody very similar walk past. It's good footage, but it's black and white. But there's something about it that made you think that it was very suspicious about this person. And he's then seen crossing the road on some footage from the corner shop, which then means he's moving down towards the Carlton area.
But then the man disappears from view. They have a prime suspect, but don't know who he is.
Having secured this footage, it was really significant. We would have huge conversations as a team about what we could do with that footage. And we made a decision to release the footage of the offender.
With any murder, we're very keen to help the police with the investigations. So at this time, police were appealing for witnesses. And there was also an evening where the police went out with an image of a suspect they wanted to speak to on the side of a van, went around the streets, and they're just raising awareness, really. I'm sure the officers spoke to the residents in the street to see if they'd heard anything. Just on a very high profile at the time. Very full-on policing, very good police work.
While Pauline continued to play through hours of footage looking for both Caroline and the suspect, the rest of the team kept searching for physical evidence.
Our initial reaction to this investigation was because of that sexual motive. We believed that a very dangerous individual was out there. On this occasion, we kept all lines of inquiry open.
We did lots of inquiries around where her shoe may have gone. We looked in all the gardens here. We did some checkings of roofs and waste ground, but we never found it. I did wonder whether the offender had actually taken it as a trophy.
It became frustrating that you can't identify the offender, but you know that you're getting closer to it, and if you keep going, you're going to hopefully find him.
In Nottingham, the body of Caroline Coyne had been found outside a house. She had been attacked by a man who had followed her after a night out.
Caroline Coyne, she was 28, just turned 28. She was a care worker. A young lady, she had some partners, she had a couple of children, very, very close to her family.
When you have a young woman who's clearly been killed by a stranger, it is always sad. But equally sadly, the nature of the injuries, what happened to her, is very typical of many of the assaults we see.
The police had found images of Caroline and her attacker on CCTV, but had no further leads.
The priorities are to see what her last movements are, how she ended up where she did.
So on the night of Caroline Coyne's death, she had been drinking at a family party. It was an address just across the park area here behind me. She'd had a minor sort of dispute and decided to leave the party. She went to a local off-licence, got a bottle of alcohol, and then she came here to this park with her half-sister. And one of the things we know is she was playing on this zip wire. We know that she fell off. And there was a time when the two of them had a conversation about going back home. And for whatever reason, Caroline said, no, I'm going somewhere else. And the two parted.
Police appealed to the public for information about any possible sightings of Caroline.
We knew what time she'd moved on from her half-sister. We then got her on Porchester Road on CCTV.
She was trying to flag cars down, she was trying to get into a taxi, she got into a taxi, she got out again, she didn't pay the fare.
We'd also got two further reports. One was from two police officers. They actually had Caroline in the back of their police car. She was in the road, they stopped their car, she gets in, uninvited. She asked them if she could be taken home.
They told her that they weren't a taxi service. She didn't appear to be drunk as such. She was confident to them. She smelled of alcohol.
And they told her that that's not what police officers are allowed to do. We don't do that. So they acted within the policy of Nottinghamshire Police, but they did direct her further up the road to where there was a taxi rank.
Caroline didn't get a taxi. She headed towards Thornywood Mount, where she encountered her attacker.
We know roughly where she's come from. Then we know I went to see where he's come from. So I look at footage on Woodbury Road, as it joins Mapley Top, and I find some more footage of him coming up another road, going in the direction of Porchester Road. So there's a good chance it may be him. There's not many other people about at that time.
The image of the male, and it clearly was a male, was very, very difficult to unravel because the man was very, very nondescript. His coat was up, a hood was up.
Despite having lots of images of the killer on CCTV, the police were no closer to identifying him. They began to search through the records of known criminals.
We looked at all manner of sexual attacks, and there was nothing similar to this in the weeks and months before this particular attack happened.
With appeals for public information still out there, exactly 1 month after the attack on Caroline, they got a break.
We got a call into the investigation room to say that another female had been attacked in similar circumstances to what we believed had happened to Caroline. So we then took on the investigation side of that sexual assault.
A 21-year-old woman called Jessica had been attacked at 4 a.m.
Jessica Price said she'd actually been on a shopping trip with some friends, but had become detached from her friends, and it was very, very late at night when she actually began to make her way home. Unfortunately, she decided to walk all the way home, a long way out of the city.
I went to see Jessica and quickly established that the nature of her attack and the way she was as a person, she was very credible, she was very willing to assist the police. Jessica wouldn't normally walk home alone at that time in the morning, but as she'd run out of money, that was her only option. So she walked up Carlton Road. She became very aware of a person walking behind her and closing in on her.
As she's leaving the city, she is propositioned by a male. She preempts that by turning and seeing him and saying, "What's the time?" Almost immediately upon sharing the time with him, she was attacked from behind, dragged across the road, up an alleyway, onto some steps of a college where there was a clear intent to sexually assault her and even rape her.
As Jessica was struggling to breathe, she managed to get the offender to release one of his hands, at which point she could talk to him, say to him, "Why did you do that? Why are you doing this? What's happening?" Very brave actions, but somehow she did it in a way that the offender listened to her and then started to engage with her.
How she did it, and I've spoken to her on many occasions, I have no idea. But she had the presence of mind to put a stop to that, but not using physical violence, by just using her voice and her conversational skills to make him stop, to make him think about what he was doing, and the attack stopped.
Jessica was very, very wary of trying to run off because she knew the offender would be able to overpower her. So her decision-making was to stay friendly with this offender and walk together with this offender as friends in the direction of her home address.
Just imagine how difficult that must be, but she did. But that meant that she had to hold his hand, for example. We had subsequently CCTV footage of her attacker, even though he was holding her hand, still pulling her and taking her and trying to drag her away from the main road into alleyways and little quiet spots near shops and things like that. But she kept on talking to him, let's stay on the main road, let's stay on the road, let's share a cigarette.
The fact that they walked away from the initial scene of the attack holding hands, in Jessica's words, it was almost like he believed she was his girlfriend. And I think it was the fact that she was playing a role that he wanted her to play, either deliberately or inadvertently. She played this role that actually meant that his fantasy was fulfilled. And that's why Jessica was saved from further attack.
Jessica walked along Carlton Road with the offender, having some conversation, acutely aware that at some point she would have to make some excuses and make her way home. She told the offender that her mother was expecting her, that she was up waiting for her, and she used this opportunity to then say to the suspect, "Can we exchange telephone numbers and can we do this another time?"
Pretending that she would see him again, Jessica gave her attacker her phone number and then slowly walked off. As soon as she got home, she rang the police.
Looking at what had happened to Jessica and knowing the location was not too far from where we'd discovered Caroline's body, we immediately thought there were similarities in both those cases, that we could be dealing with the same offender.
She didn't have a name, but she gave us a very, very good description, including a tattoo that he had on his hand. So I had a lot of detail around it. The fact that you may have possibly got closer to your offender is, of course, massively important. The fact that you haven't caught your offender before he's had the opportunity to attack a second female is really, really not good. You know, I've talked to Jessica about it, and I wish that didn't happen. But absolutely, because it did happen, it was massively significant in the investigation in relation to what happened to Caroline Coyne.
Thanks to Jessica, the team now had a much better description of the man they suspected of killing Caroline.
She described him in quite significant detail. He had on similar type of clothing on that evening as he had on during the attack of Caroline Coyne. She described him as somebody that she thought had a mixed-race heritage but was extremely light-skinned.
Jessica was also able to help the police find more evidence.
Jessica Price, during the attack, which was horrendous, showed such strength of character that she, post the events of the attack, was able to take 2 officers back to the bus stop where she had shared a cigarette with the attacker and knew exactly which cigarette they'd discarded on the floor.
From the cigarette butt found at the scene, the DNA could have been extracted from the dried saliva and a characteristic profile could have been created.
As the forensic team waited to see if the DNA would give them a name, an informant came forward with the name of a known criminal from the area. Tony asked his analysis to look into it and see if he could be the man seen on CCTV.
So then when we get a name and we begin to look at that name, we think, that's not quite right, but it could be very, very similar.
Tony and his analyst looked for a similar sounding name on the long list of potential offenders they had drawn up.
Amongst all those hundreds of names that we had, Carl Powell was on that list. That's when he comes and says, I've looked closely at Carl Powell and I think it's him. And then I look at Carl Powell's image and I look at the CCTV image of the offender for Jessica Price. And it's Carl Powell.
Tony had a suspect, but needed more evidence to link him to the attack on Jessica.
Now I'm saying, what about the DNA that we've set off? When's that going to come?
Shortly after the offence, the cigarette end had been sent for analysis and it came back with the DNA on it.
And it took about 2 hours and they came back with the answer. And I got the name Carl Powell.
Jessica Price had been attacked in Nottingham on Wednesday the 24th of August 2011. Now it was Friday and suddenly the team had a prime suspect. A man named Carl Powell.
The attack on Jessica was very, very similar to what we believe had happened to Caroline Coyne. The offender had been predatory in that nature and there was a sexual element to it. These 2 locations where Jessica had been attacked and where we knew Caroline had been found were very, very close, perhaps within less than half a mile between each location. So we strongly suspected Carl Powell had been involved in the Caroline Coyne investigation.
Senior Investigating Officer Tony was about to go public with information about the attack on Jessica, so needed to decide his next move quickly.
I decide that I'm going to arrest Carl Powell, but I'm going to arrest him the following morning. So we decided to go ahead with this media release, but we also put out a lot of extra patrols because I could not run the risk that Carl Powell, having just attacked Jessica Price, might do something again that night, and I was very, very nervous about that.
It looked like the team had found their killer. Officers were sent out to arrest Powell and bring him to the station.
Carl Powell was arrested in the early hours of the 27th of August. That was the Saturday morning after we did all the media releases. He was asleep at his girlfriend's address and he was arrested on suspicion of the attack on Jessica Price initially. Clearly we had a lot more evidence there. We had the cigarette. We searched all of his home. We found what we subsequently identified as the clothing that he had on during the night of the attack on Caroline Coyne.
As officers arrested Powell, CCTV investigator Pauline was searching footage of the hours before the attack, looking for him.
When we'd got the name of Carl, started looking at him, obviously he was interviewed in relation to the assault on Jessica, and any information that he came up with or what he was saying, then I would either try to confirm or prove wrong by looking at further CCTV to get to know what his movements were and if he could be the same offender as for Caroline.
The footage was able to place Powell in the area of the attack on Caroline some hours before.
Some of the inquiry then moved to Sherwood, public house there, where we could see him approaching the public house, broad daylight, going into the public house and in there mixing with people, talking with people, coming out for a cigarette. I could match that with the person that I could see who'd attacked Caroline. One of the things was the bag he was carrying. I was quite happy that that was him.
Once we charged Powell with murder, it was my job to inform the family that we'd charged Carl and that he was going to court. The family were very, very relieved to hear that we'd caught somebody who we believed was responsible for Caroline's death.
Powell, however, was still claiming he had nothing to do with the attack. The police had to gather as much evidence as they could, linking him to the location of the murder.
In relation to the amount of footage taken, there were in excess of 330 items from approximately 100 different locations.
He, on both accounts, both attacks, wasn't going to contest that it was him that we had some CCTV footage of. Now, that's interesting as an investigator. You've got an individual that's not phased to say, yes, that was me, I was around at the time with both of these attacks, but let me tell you, I didn't attack either of these females. It was only when we showed him the footage in its entirety, how he had followed her in, been out of shot and then running back, that he then decided, I don't think I want to speak to the officers anymore, conducting the interviews.
In the following weeks, Carl Powell went to court to register his pleas in relation to both the attack on Jessica Price and the murder of Caroline Coyne.
He denied any wrongdoing in both offences. After that, we'd remanded him, he stayed in custody, and then he appeared at Nottingham Crown Court on various occasions until finally his trial begun about 12 months later.
The first time I saw Carl Powell actually was at Nottingham Crown Court when he stepped into the dock and was addressed by his name, and the picture of the man stood there was someone who's quite soft features, quite baby-faced, someone quite young really, so I don't really know if you can have an image of a person who would murder somebody because every murder is different, but he just seemed quite clean-cut and not capable of doing something like this.
On the 2nd of October 2012, the trial began.
Every day it was on television and in the local paper, it was in the national papers. It was quite a big thing at the time.
Carl Powell pleaded not guilty to both offences.
We'd set up a full trial where all our witnesses in the murder and the sex assault on Jessica were called to court. Jessica herself went to court and was immensely brave and courageous in standing in the box and giving her evidence.
He just grabbed me from behind by the neck and started sort of trying to drag me across the road. He terrified me to begin with, and I don't know what would have happened if he had held my neck down for a lot longer, because there was a good period of time where I couldn't breathe.
I think the evidence given by Jessica Price was very good. She was given a hard time in the witness box. She remained very calm.
Police showed the court that Powell had been looking for someone to attack that night.
With the CCTV, prior to Jessica being attacked, on that evening he'd gone into town and he was approaching women.
The evidence was so compelling that you could see members of the jury believing exactly what Jessica had said. Throughout this, Powell was looking around the court, very arrogant.
We did see CCTV in court of him actually talking to her, so it's quite a sinister image of him considering what he'd done just a month earlier. He was really just trying to sort of persuade her to go with him, so she was extremely lucky.
The police were able to prove that Carl and Jessica had met via the DNA recovered from the cigarette, but they had no similar evidence linking him to Caroline.
One of the things that made the case even more difficult to solve was the fact that we had no DNA, no forensic evidence of Caroline's body. However, we knew that Powell had been wearing gloves that night, and we suspect they had gloves on at the time of attacking Caroline.
During the trial, I showed the CCTV, and then I had to give evidence in the witness box in relation to what I'd shown.
But the main evidence was that he was there in that area at the time, and when you saw all the different clips together, although a lot of it's circumstantial evidence, it did put him in that location at that time.
Powell was very arrogant and seemed to think that he'd done nothing wrong and that he'd be cleared of any wrongdoing.
He did give evidence and he did deny the offence, and he said that he was in that area at the time because he heard these noises. I think it was a car horn, there was some screeching, so he went to go and have a look and he was being nosy. So that would explain why he was in that area at that time.
Throughout the trial, Powell's defence team continued to plead his innocence and attempted to prove Caroline had not been murdered.
Carl Powell's defence, we knew from the outset, was going to be. I wasn't the person that followed Caroline Coyne all the way down in Thornwood Mount. I didn't sexually assault her. I wasn't responsible for her injuries. And in relation to Jessica Price, we did have some sexual contact, but it was consensual, and she's either making it up or she's lying.
The defence team went on to say that Caroline had died from injuries she had got when she was drunk.
One of the complications that arose was she was supposed to have been in a play park and to have bumped her head. That is a potential explanation for a head injury. But in her case, the magnitude of that impact to the head was not in keeping with the magnitude of the injury to the brain, and the sort of direct damage to the brain was such that she would have been unconscious, if not dead, after that. She would not have been walking around for 2-3 hours, albeit inebriated, and on that basis you can pretty much rule out that as the significant event.
The prosecution was able to counter all Powell's arguments with the police evidence.
The Crown Court trial lasted 3 weeks, in which time we presented our prosecution case to the jury, and the fact that we believe Powell was a dangerous individual who was out late at night, predominantly target young, vulnerable women for the purposes of a sex assault.
I felt very confident about the evidence that we were presenting, that there was enough, certainly with the CCTV, to convict him of both of the offences.
So the jury went out and considered all the evidence, and they came back and found him guilty of murder and assault with intent to commit a sexual offence and sexual assault on the second victim.
The judge then goes out and came back in, and in this circumstances he sentenced Carl Powell to a minimum of 20 years. So it's 20 years before Carl Powell can even think about approaching a parole board. Is it long enough? I don't know. But you know, the people that really feel it are the family, and they were content, but of course they're not happy. Caroline Coyne's died. You know, Jessica Price, you know, she's gone through all of that. You know, she's moved on, her life's moved on, but Caroline Coyne, you know, she's not here.
I believe that had Jessica not engaged with Powell at the time of being strangled, unable to breathe, in fear for her life, that she would have come to a similar end to that Caroline came to.
Carl Powell was convicted and given a minimum tariff of 20 years. As somebody who's seen a lot of outcomes of murder trials, that is a long tariff. He will be in prison for a long time, And having seen what he did to Carolyn, that is a good thing.